All right, guys. Today we're here with a very special guest. Today is my first collab video on this channel. And of course, if we're going to have a collab on this channel, I'm going to start off with pokeaimMD. If you can say hi.
Yeah, pokeaim. I am ready. Multiple is someone who is a friend of mine who has given me a bunch of suggestions for videos, and when I do them, they come out great.
Thanks. I'm glad to hear that. I like the videos that you've been coming out with recently, and I thought today we could do a video in a sort of a similar vein. I wanted to talk today about the UBERS tier, and specifically the Gen 8 UBERS tier, and why I think it's not very good, and potentially about why I don't think UBERS as it stands will be good in the future.
Yeah, I'm interested to see your opinion on it, and obviously, I'll voice mine as well as we keep going.
Yeah. So to start off, I thought we might consider sort of the history of UBERS, at least a couple generations back. UBERS has gone over some crazy changes, right? We used to have permanent weather, and there used to be Deoxys speed ties in the beginning in Gen 4, right? A lot of things have changed.
Yeah.
Like in Gen 4 specifically, because you didn't have team preview, that really shaped how the metagame was back in those days. And then with Generation 6, you got Mega Evolutions, and that completely warped it again. And so I sort of wanted to stick with just more recent generations, just so this video doesn't go on for too long. And because I think that it was really Generation 6 that changed a lot of how the metagame looks, to the point where the UBERS tier is the way it is nowadays. So in generations... sorry.
Oh, I apologize. I'm just trying to figure out... But yeah, go ahead.
So whenever you start a generation, I feel like what are you looking at? It was usually the box legendaries. The box legendaries, of course, are the ones that are going to get auto banned to UBERS because they have that policy of box legendaries equals auto ban or whatever it is. And then you have so in X and Y you have Xerneas and Yveltal, and immediately you look at those and say, okay, yeah, those are really powerful UBERS. They really shaped the XY metagame, really powerful, especially Xerneas, right? Everybody was scrambling to try to figure out how do we deal with the geomancy, right? And then
that was one of the most broken things, actually, and that's also that mon itself shaped UBERS completely. X and Y UBERS was literally whatever you wanted. Your Yveltal, your Arceus form, and your Xerneas, and then the rest were like your Xerneas answer. And then Oras came out after. And then we finally got a Xerneas answer in Primal Groudon, which obviously changed everything in itself.
Right. And when Oras came out, we got Primal Groudon, we got Kyogre, and we even had for a little bit Mega Rayquaza. And those, in their own way, shaped the UBERS tier. So you had box legendaries in X and Y, then you had box legendaries in Oras, and each time they came out, it completely rewrote the metagame, right?
Yes.
Then when we get into Sun and Moon, it was a little bit different. Maybe Solgaleo Lunala didn't have quite the impact as the previous generation. But then Ultra Sun and Moon came out and just immediately blew that back because you had Necrozma. And Necrozma is crazy.
Best answers, one of the best answers to so many multiple Pokemon. Xerneas being one of them, obviously, in the game. Just period. One of the greatest support, great offensive. And not even that. Like you said, Ultra Necrozma. And then Necrozma Duskmane, and obviously Necrozma, Necrozma Duskmane is obviously one of the biggest one, but Ultra Necrozma was also its own big thing too. The fact that the other two could become it, that was the big thing, right? You could run special Necrozma Duskmane as a lure for like a Ferrothorn or something, and people would go into that for like a
physical or something. Dragon Dance, yeah.
Exactly. And the other one having the extra bow and the high speed tier.
And they just heat wave you. Yeah.
Exactly.
And of course Dawn Wings is there too, but I mean Dawn Wings would have still been a major threat as Ultra Necrozma if Duskmane hadn't been just superior.
I agree. And also there are some situations where you do want Dawn Wings, so not very few I think, but it's still decent.
Yeah, for sure. And so going into Sword and Shield, you look at the box legendaries and you say, okay, clearly these are going to go straight to UBERS, and you expect them to have an impact on the metagame. But then we saw one of them, of course, not be that great, but then the other one be so great that it had to get banned twice. Right, Zacian it was insane. I don't know why they let Zacian run around for as long as they did. I guess because they were still trying to figure out Dynamax, and that held their attention first.
Exactly, yeah. So, like, I mean, we were discussing prior to recording, right? Dynamax, I think, was actually pretty good in UBERS, right? It was fine in UBERS, in my opinion. When everything could Dynamax, it was stupid.
Yeah, especially Ditto.
It was stupid. Yes, Ditto specifically. But when they made that ban list that only let the non-Pokemon on their list Dynamax, and they literally made a list. It wasn't just Pokemon that are UBERS based on stats. They made a specific list of Pokemon that could not Dynamax. When they made that, I really liked the tier because, again, we were talking about how you could potentially use something like, what's the mon called? Damn it. Centiskorch. Yeah, Dreadnought, Centiskorch, things like that as counters to, or as there were options, right? Because, you know, rain is something this generation that isn't ran because you already talked about the infinite weather, but if I could set up my own rain on a sweeper, I'm in a really good spot. So it's just something that, like, us losing that was pretty big, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that one of the big problems with Zacian, if you look at it, people scrambled for answers, and I think there was this expectation that they'd be able to find some kind of answer. Because with Xerneas, Xerneas was oppressive in Generation 6, especially in X and Y, but people found answers, right? You had Arceus forms, especially E-Killer. You had an Arc Poison for some reason had to be ran for a while there. Mega Gengar, Mega Lucario. You even had Mega Kangaskhan to some extent. Aegislash. So you had quite a few answers to Xerneas, and I think the expectation maybe with Zacian was that, well, eventually we'll be able to figure this out. Eventually we'll find something, but then it just ended up being Quagsire and pray they don't have Solar Blade.
Yeah, and that was big, right? Like, literally, Quagsire is a big one, right? Quagsire was one of the #1 most used Pokemon in the tier, which is so funny to think about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like a Quagsire being as good as it is. So, when they eventually gave us they got rid of that, right? And that's when Zacian started taking over fully. And this is also at this point, people are starting to fully understand the brokenness of, what's it called? This is before, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to mix up my matters. I want to make sure we get them all properly, but this was before, we had the Crown Tundra and all that stuff, or right after the Crown Tundra, excuse me. This was before, like, everything else. This is when, like, we were getting the before we have current UBERS right now, right? Before Calyrex and everything, right, is what I'm trying to say. So this was like, it's established thing where you could actually still use something like Quagsire. You can't anymore, obviously.
Yeah. No, I think that the once Zacian got banned, the UBERS tier really settled down. But it was sort of funny at the same time that Zacian got banned, then we had the Isle of Armor and the Crown Tundra specifically come in and completely throw things out again. And I think that one of the other big problems with Zacian specifically is that they didn't have the Crown Tundra, and the Crown Tundra brought back all those other legendaries that previously weren't in the game, right? If I'm not mistaken, through all the raid dens. And so that's when we got a bunch of those old legendaries. I don't really know if they would have helped, like Reshiram's not beating Zacian, but it would have been something at least to have shaken up the metagame. And I think that if we had Arceus, maybe.
That's the big one we're missing, right?
Mm-hmm.
If Arceus is allowed, we can do so much. Like, if Arceus is here, we can end up running even fully Phys-F support ones. Like, I don't think Zacian would still be around. Right? Don't get me wrong. Zacian's still banned.
Yeah.
Even if Arceus is here, Zacian's still banned. But Eternatus can't do exactly what it wants to do. It also stops Yveltal from doing exactly what it wants to do. Yveltal has like 90 billion% usage right now.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like 70% plus usage. Calyrex forms can't run Mono Ghost unless there's Subseed, and then Yveltal can stall that out, type of thing. Or they could technically stall out Yveltal, depending. But there is just, Arceus would hold the tier together and also just not make it as crazy as it is. Like Combine Arceuses, for instance.
Yeah.
Sub-Combine Arceuses, which couldn't be Dragon-tailed out by Eternatus or Toxic type of thing. Like, those would be running it. Like, Arceus would still be the top dog. I think one of the biggest things, besides the fact that we got Zacian and stuff, and obviously Calyrex is Eternus is one of the craziest Pokemon of all time this time, right? We have a Pokemon that's immune to poison, one of the biggest things that you want from an Uber, right? Because the way most people wear down Pokemon is poison, has pressure, so it's taking it, and has insane stats. But yes, please go on.
Yeah. So let's talk now about the third. So you have your 2 box legendaries and you have your third Pokemon. We talked a little bit about, I suppose, Mega Rayquaza, but then you have the weirdness that is Zygarde, because Zygarde in Gen 6, of course, was not good. Never saw really usage until it got Thousand Arrows and it got its complete form, right? And so you say, well, Zygarde is a good Pokemon in Ubers, but it wasn't in Gen 6, so there was a bit of a delay there. But Zygarde was quite good eventually, and it is a very good Pokemon. And then you get Necrozma, which I would argue is better than Zygarde in complete form. And then you have Eternatus, which is better than both of those. So we can definitely see some general power creep in that direction.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of concern for me, I think. Before we get into looking towards the future, the other thing I wanted to cover was maybe the mythicals a bit. So in Gen 6, if you look at the mythical Pokemon that we got in that generation, we didn't get anything useful. Right? You got Mega Diancie, you got Volcanion, you got Hoopa Unbound, which was Ubers in Gen 6. None of those Pokemon saw usage in Ubers, really.
Yeah,
that's
true.
And then Gen 7, what did we even get?
Well, not Genesect. Genesect was decent in Ubers in Gen 6. It was decent.
Yeah, that was Gen 5. That was Gen 5 Uber, right?
Gen 5, it was the best Uber in the tier with a choice scarf set. It was literally the best Uber. It was better than Kyogre, and Kyogre was considered the best Uber in the tier. It was. I literally just did a video on Genesect.
Yeah.
Well, it's coming out. It's coming out soon. But it was literally the best Uber in the damn tier. So it's interesting to think about, because the your point is being that these Bandmon don't exist anymore, right? In a sense.
My contention is that if we look at the mythical Pokemon that came out in Gen 6, the mythical Pokemon that came out in Gen 7 and Gen 8, I want to show sort of that they progressively get more problematic.
Yes.
So in Gen 6, you had Diancie, you had Hoopa, and you had Volcanion. Those Pokemon weren't in Ubers at all, except for Hoopa, which was at the bottom of Ubers. And then you had Gen 7, and you got Marshadow. And that was a huge mythical Pokemon because it completely changed the way E-Killers ran. It completely stopped a bunch of hyper offense teams, or enabled them, depending on who you were. And so that was a really big mythical. And then in Gen 8, we have crazy mythicals in Calyrex, and Urshifu's there too, which did numbers on OU. But Calyrex really was a big one. And I think that we're going to have to watch out for the mythicals as well as the box legendaries to continue sort of this trend of power creep.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point. And even in Urshifu's case, when it could Dynamax, it was pretty nasty in the tier 2 on offenses and stuff as well, in Ubers, in a sense. So that mon isn't. Am I remembering the right thing? Could that mon Dynamax?
Well, it did, I believe, for a while, because I remember when they were trying to suspect test in Baton Pass, I kept on getting messed up by Urshifu Rapid Strike, I feel like, and that was during the Dynamax metagame, if I recall.
I was thinking too, right? It kept Gmax Flow, right?
Whatever it is,
I just remember the avatar, because for some reason Urshifu still doesn't have an avatar with that 3 years later.
So weird.
Yeah. But yeah, so I agree with your point. Yeah, they're getting crazier and crazier. You could argue that they're decent. The other ones are okay. The mythicals are Hoopa. You could argue something for, but even then, why would I use Hoopa in the tier when I can use a faster, still just as strong Pokemon,
Mega Mewtwo X or something?
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. And I think that it's interesting as well if you consider what makes these Pokemon more broken. Can we quantify it in some way? And it's hard because you can't necessarily look at their stats. Their stats remain fairly flat. It's about 670, 680 for most legendaries. Zacian Crowned, of course, comes out at more I think it's 720. So there's a bit more there, but even normal Zacian is still busted. And I think, if I recall correctly, it's 670, I want to say, is its BST. I don't currently have it pulled up, but that sounds right. And so I don't think you can necessarily just say that this Pokemon is busted because of its base stat total, and we're just giving them more points overall. I think that's sort of how the TCG does things. If you look at the trading card game, you get crazy HP numbers, right? Back in the base set, Charizard had 120 HP. That was insane. Who has 120 HP? Nowadays, you got things with like, I don't know, 300, 400, 500 HP regularly. And then they're doing crazy amounts of damage. And that's how they do power creep over there. And I guess I can't say any more than that because I don't know anything about the TCG. But what I do know is that that's not happening here, right? The base stat total is not changing. But then we could look at the abilities and we could say, well, why are the abilities to blame? And I think to some extent they could be. So for instance, if you look at Xerneas gets Fairy Aura, and Yveltal gets Dark Aura, whatever it is, and they boost their power of their attacks. So that gives them an automatic buff to whatever stat they're using offensively. Yeah. Then you get the Kyogre Groudon pair who buff their stats as well through their inherent weather. Of course, that was something they already could do, but now they're doing it with actually a boosted base stat total because they're primal reverting. So now they actually are sitting above 700 BST just because of that. And it's a permanent weather condition while they're on the field. So you can't mess around with that. So that's really powerful. Then you get into Solgaleo Lunala. Well, I think one of the reasons why they were so underwhelming was because their abilities were rather underwhelming, right? Clear Body, not that great. And Shadow Shield is a little bit better, but I don't think it has the typing for it. So
yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. It was fine with Boots, but besides that, like, I agree with you. It doesn't really have the greatest typing for it.
Yeah, and Gen 7 didn't even have Boots, so it was pretty not great. Come in, take Toxic Spikes, and now you're ruined. Then you get Necrozma, who on the surface, I don't think Necrozma's ability, the base one, not Ultra, I don't think most people would look at that and say that's a fantastic ability, but Prism Armor does allow Dragon Dance sweeps from Necrozma with Weakness Policy and other things. So I think that is somewhat scary.
Yeah.
So it's hard to necessarily judge an ability by its cover. I think it's the ability in combination with the Pokemon. And so if we look at Eternatus is Pressure. That's one of the most boring abilities in the game. But that actually helps it. It specifically, right? How many Lugias are running Pressure nowadays? I can't think of anybody running Lugia, but if Lugia were being ran, it would still probably run Multiscale, am I right?
Yeah. It would 100% win Multiscale. Multiscale is just worth it. Just better. And
Zapdos in OU has completely foregone running Pressure. It's always running Static nowadays, because that's just so much more reliable, even though, it's still 30% versus 100% Pressure, but it's still got more utility, and so it's more reliably being used over the course of a game. So I think that it's hard necessarily to judge, but looking at Zacian's ability, obviously that's clearly busted, and Calorex's ability is insanely busted.
Yeah, it's like, because it's literally like you said, it is the stats and it's the ability. Like, there's no other way to say this mon is not broken, right? This mon has too much going for it. It has insane stats. Its ability allows it to kind of just win, right? Kind of just win games on its own, which is the biggest thing, I think. Like, it doesn't have to do anything, right? That's the biggest thing. It doesn't have to do anything to get these things up there, right? It doesn't have to. It just exists. It simply exists, and that is enough to make. That's enough to make it be the problem it is. That's literally enough to make it the problem it is, because it doesn't exist. So it doesn't. It can just bring it out, right? It's free, is what I'm trying to get at. Like, it's just absolute free. The mon doesn't have to do anything in order to get itself out there, in a sense, right? Like, it doesn't have to do crap. It just comes out and it has the attack investment and the +1 attack and it wins. And if you actually see in VGC, there were people that were running bulky sets because you don't even have to think when it came to this. Like, you do not have to think at all. You just win the game and you run the max HP and you don't lose to anything else. So yeah, I don't know. It's just a crazy mon, dude.
Yeah.
And again, it's the abilities just to make it. Like Eternus would not be half the threat it is if I had all my attacks versus them. You know what I mean? Like, it's like Corviknight, right? Corviknight is still an incredible mon, and Pressure just made it that much better. Like, it already has the typing, it already has whatever. And then, not to mention its damn moves, right? Cosmic Power plus Pressure is just crazy. So yeah, the abilities are definitely what make these mons insane.
Yeah, and I think
it's what makes it even more.
Abilities plus, I think, move pool is a big one.
Yeah.
Because if you didn't have Cosmic Power, if you didn't have Recover, imagine if Eternatus didn't have Recover. Then it wouldn't be good.
It'd be so much,
I mean, it would be fine, but it wouldn't be amazing. I think that you have to look at the moves as well. So we have the stats, we have the ability, and we have the move pool. And you've got to have all three. So, for instance, if Eternatus had Levitate, I think people might say that it was good for other reasons. But, of course, then it couldn't absorb toxic spikes and it wouldn't be able to pressure stall you. So it really just depends on, I guess, what Game Freak wants to do with it. I bet some people at Game Freak looking at Eternatus said, Pressure is such a boring ability. Nobody uses it anymore. We've made such a busted Pokemon. Let's just give it a really boring ability. And they didn't realize that they actually made something that was completely heinous.
Absolutely insane. Yeah, agree with you completely. Like when I'm thinking about Eternus, I think about it as the number one Yveltal switch in the tier.
And you have to have an Yveltal switch in because Yveltal is so good and has to be ran on every team because otherwise you will lose to Calyrex.
Exactly.
And I guess to some extent also Necrozma as well as why it's there. So you have to have an Yveltal, and you have to have an Yveltal answer, and Eternatus is the Yveltal answer.
Exactly. That's just it's the GOAT.
Mm-hmm. And I think going back to stats, I think one of the big things, so I mentioned previously that the stats haven't gotten any more numbers. They still have the same base stat total, but what they have done is they've started optimizing the stats. So I wanted to talk about 3 different Pokemon. So we've got Palkia, we've got Xerneas, and we've got Zacian. And just base Zacian, we're not even looking at Crowned. So Palkia has 100 speed stat, which if you think about 100 speed stat, like it's okay, but it's not great in Uber's tier, right?
Yeah.
Like it still has speeds, I think, Groudon, so that's fine, but it's still getting outsped by Arceus, by Mewtwo, by so many other Pokemon. So not fantastic. And Palkia has 120 attack. Now I know that Blissey is a thing in the tier, and one of Palkia's biggest problems, so maybe you could argue that having 120 attack is actually beneficial for Palkia, so it can run a mix set for Blissey specifically. But outside of that context, I feel like having 120 dumped into attack when usually you just want to nuke with special attacks. Like imagine if you had taken off 40, given a base attack of 80, and put that 40 into speed. Now Palkia's 140 speed. Be a completely different Pokemon.
I mean, look at the Legends Arceus ones, right? Exactly like what we're talking about. Like, it's that Palkia has 372 speed, right? That Palkia is insane in a sense. Like that Palkia specifically has crazy potential to actually do things because of that. Like you said, the crazy speed tier. So it's again, it is the move pool and everything, because I wouldn't be able to play them on like I want to play it if it wasn't for everything about it. Yeah. And so it's a big combination of things, which is what makes it really interesting, right? Because when you look at those Pokemon, like you said, Palkia, right? They came from being a literal demon, right? Being a literal demon in the tier to being this, honestly, I don't want to say underpilling, but like not as cool, not as great, not as like when Primal Groudon came out, right? Palkia basically stopped appearing in a sense.
Yeah, and it was already struggling from Blissey, like right off the rip, right?
Exactly, yeah. And one of the sets was Z-moves let it do heal block and stuff like that, but even then it was still like struggling from them. But
and if you think about Palkia's synergy with its ability, pressure on Palkia doesn't do it any good at all. It has no recovery. and it doesn't have much in the way of stalling, right? So it doesn't need pressure. Imagine if you gave Palkia Fish's Rend or something, or I guess that's not an ability, but you give it something. Give it a rack when its ability.
Water bubble. I've literally used. I have a video called Water Bubble Palkia from an OM, or Water Bubble Keldeo. Whatever, same Pokemon.
Mm-hmm.
Same Pokemon in a sense.
Same idea.
Two good stats.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the Mon itself is just. It's the big thing that makes it. And then you come to this UBERS, and I agree completely. It's not even just the mythicals at this point. It's the Mons they're creating as well, right? Because power creep only goes up and up, and they also make these Pokemon in mind of whatever broken secondary thing they're doing, right? That's something we have to keep in mind. You had Mega Pokemon, that was it. So they had Pokemon like Xerneas and Yveltal who boosted their own stats to do more damage to potentially Megas, as well as and then they gave Xerneas the broken Geomancy, right? And then Generation 7, you had C moves, and they made Pokemon that can Ultra Burst and take advantage of Z moves very well, right? Yeah. And then Generation 8, they made these Mons that can't Dynamax themselves, but all their signature moves are strong versus Dynamax, and they're fast. So they're literally doing it to keep up. So I can't even imagine, like, it's weird to see what the Gen 8 ones are going to be because we're riding around them the entire game. It's really weird to see, like, what's
the Gen 9
it
Pokemon
actually going to be like. Yeah.
Like,
what is it actually going to be like? Gen 9, yeah, sorry, I said Gen 8, but Gen 9.
And it's hard to gauge them. I mean, obviously, in a couple of days, I'm sure the games will have leaked and we'll know their stats and whatever. But if you look at something like Zamazenta, I would have guessed going into this that it would have had like base 80 speed, right? Give it base 200 defense on both sides, give it base 180 HP, but give it base 80 speed. But how fast is Zamazenta? It's ridiculously fast, right? It's like 140 speed or something stupid when it's crowned.
It's literally something stupid. Yes, 10,000%.
And it doesn't make any sense. Now, of course, as an offensive threat, that's cool, but it doesn't synergize as an offensive threat because it doesn't get the +1 to attack like Zacian does. If it did, I think it would be maybe banned. It's hard to know, but yeah, it would definitely be a lot better, of course. So yeah, I think the one of the big problems is that their stat lines have become more optimized. So we looked at Palkia and how it was dumping all those points into attack. Xerneas has 131 in both of its attack stats. It never uses its attack stat, as base 99 speed, but it's mitigated by Geomancy. So Geomancy allows Xerneas to, of course, be relevant. And then when you get to Zacian, they said, okay, we're done with subtlety. We're giving you 130 attack stat in base form, and 138 speed, and 80 special attack. Most other legendaries, they would have given that tons of attack, right? Yeah,
literally. I mean, I do want to note that I don't think this means that 100% that I want to know that this doesn't mean that 100% like Zacian would be Xerneas would be bad without Geomancy, right? That's just its most threatening set immediately. Like, the other sets are still decent versus it.
I mean, Choice Scarf is good, and it's got a.
It has Rest Talk sets, Rest Talk Geomancy sets, Z sets with Ingrain were pretty broken too. Like, it has good sets.
But I would still argue that in a metagame where I can Dragon Dance up once with my Necrozma, or even have my Zygarde outspeed the Xerneas without the ability to get past that 100 base speed tier, and where I get immediate +2, I don't think Xerneas would be nearly as good. Yveltal, of course, doesn't have a move like that, but it has so many other utility options, right? Knockoff, Oblivion Wing, Sucker Punch, Taunt, Roost, Defog, Toxic. The list goes on. I made a video about the most perfect Pokemon, and Yveltal was number 1. But
as it should be.
But Xerneas doesn't have that, in my opinion. It doesn't have the diverse move pool that allows it to hit on both the physical and special side. It does get close combat and Horn Leech, but nobody's using those. Even though it has that big weakness to steel, you could use close combat. That makes sense. But no, we're not, because it's not a very strong move coming off of that.
Yeah, unnecessary.
Yeah, and so I think that the Xerneas would be worse without Geomancy. And just to say, though, that stat distribution isn't well distributed, right? If you had changed the speed stat and the attack stat, give it 131 speed, 99 attack, well, then Xerneas would be a monster, right?
Yeah. I agree.
Even without Geomancy, it would still be fantastic. And I think that's sort of the trend we're headed in, where they want to make these Pokemon a little more optimized. And I think we can see that as well with the third legendaries. So Giratina, why does Giratina have such a whack stat distribution? I don't like Giratina, either of its forms, stat distribution. But if you look...
I think in that case, you have to kind of take into account the generation it came out in. Ghost Dragon is pretty nasty in Gen 4, right? And couple that with Levitate. So that also could be a case where, like you said, they have to update certain things too. Right? We were, Generation 4 is a generation where Infernape was considered insanely fast, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Base 100 was considered fast, and then anything higher was like insane, right? And now we're like, we have Pokemon that start at level 5 with 328 speed, so there's this huge difference going forward. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's rough because they still have the same base stat total for the most part, but they're just getting more optimized, I think, right? Eternatus having 130 speed, 145 special attack. That's ridiculously optimized to the point where I don't think that the other guys can keep up with it, even if they still have the same points to work with. They're just not using them as effectively. And then, of course, that they get more threatening move sets, which is sort of funny, though, because in this generation, they removed so many moves for the base Pokemon, right? How many Pokemon didn't get Toxic this generation? Like, most of them don't get Toxic this generation. And a bunch of other moves that you would think would normally be on some of the normal Pokemon in Galar just aren't. But the legendaries didn't have that problem, except for maybe Zamazenta. They just got all the moves that they needed. And the only exception to that, I think, would be Spectre. And that's just because if they did that, Spectre would be uber, it would be crazy. So that's the only exception I can think. And I guess the Regis, but that's their whole gimmick.
Yeah, the Regis are supposed to be crazy.
Yeah, but like crazy only on their typing.
Yeah. Which is, I think, fine.
Mm-hmm.
For what they are, anyway.
Although I think that maybe the VGC players would have something to say about that. So I think that there are a few problems, and one of the first problems in Generation 8, like why is it that in Generation 8 specifically we are having so much problems? Because if everybody's power creeping, then this shouldn't be an issue, right? It's just a new generation, and that's just how it's going to be. But I think the first problem as to why UBERS this generation isn't good, and we've alluded to this previously, is the Arceus isn't here. We don't have the versatility, the crazy BST, and the you don't know which one I'm bringing until I show it to you kind of gameplay the Arceus brings.
Yeah, I think I can agree with that. Like, if Arceus was indeed still in the tier, it's kind of like when they added Arceus to what's it called? When they ended up adding it to the DPP, when it only had 100 stats all around,
right?
It ended up being insanely broken, in a sense, because it just couldn't. It was too much, even with 100 stats across the board. You could sweep, which is interesting to think about, right? Like how. And so if you think about that with just 100 stats, like surely Arceus with crazy stats otherwise would still be broken, right? Like surely it would. So it's very interesting to think about, like the lack of Arceus in the meta, what it does to the meta itself.
Yeah, I think that you always bring an Arceus form, almost always, unless you're running some really heinous
offense,
stall.
Defense, stall. I think even stall should always have Arceus. You have Arceus Fairy or Arceus Steel, or this. You always had Arceus Water with Toxic Defog.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. So I think though that having those options really means Jeff to counterplay. So Arceus Fairy is a big one, I think. for cutting down on Yveltal. If we had E-Killer right now, that would help a lot with another answer to Calyrex to an extent. I still can get side shocked, but I can still mess you up with Shadow Claw, which I'm carrying already from our Shadow.
Yep.
And you have Arceus Steel, which is useful. Arceus Water at times is useful in metagames. Arceus Ground is another big one for Necrozma specifically. And I think that would really help. I think the second option, or the second problem that UBERS is having right now is that Calyrex is in the tier. Really, I don't like banning offensive Pokemon, but I do think Calyrex is a major problem in UBERS.
It is. Like, I think nobody thinks otherwise from you, right? They don't want to ban it, but literally no one thinks otherwise. Like, that Mon is a problem in the damn tier, period. It's the reason why Yveltal is as good as it is. And even if Kalos was banned, Yveltal would still be insanely high, though. Don't get me wrong.
No, it would be.
Like, Yveltal still gets the defog, it still gets the knockoff, it's still one of the better Pokemon. Like, it doesn't only check that, it checks the Crosby Dust Main as well. Which Dragon Dance gets better. And Dragon Dance is already good, it's already used. But it gets even better with the Pokemon that at +1 easily outspeeds it, aka Calyrex. So, you might even see more of Yveltal, in a sense.
Yeah,
but every game isn't about toxicking the Yveltal or knocking off the Yveltal, trying to get a toxic, playing it, tricking it type of thing. Not that every game is that, but
yeah. I think that if you had Arceus and you got rid of the horse, I think that then Yveltal might simmer down a bit, just because with Arceus Ground and Arceus Fairy, you're checking Necrozma and Yveltal better. I could be wrong. But I think that those two things would definitely settle the metagame down. But unfortunately, the first one can't happen because we just don't have Arceus. And the second one probably won't happen until the Scarlet and Violet comes out. And then I'm sure 2 years down the line, the UBERS community will decide to ban it. But that doesn't really mean much because that means 5 people decided to ban it. Then I think that the other big problem with UBERS, and this is something I've had for a couple generations now, but I think it's getting worse. If you look at the UBERS tier used to be a ban list for OU. So it wasn't even a playable metagame until Anything Goes was created, right?
Yeah, until actually Anything Goes was created, and then it ended up becoming
an official metagame. Yeah, it was playable, it just wasn't an official metagame until Anything Goes. And so in that regard, I think that we should really split up more Pokemon into Anything Goes. I think that we should ban more Pokemon from UBERS personally. And make UBERS be the Pokemon that are too good for OU, but aren't necessarily, it's not the end all be all, right? Because I think that if we're not willing to ban Pokemon from UBERS, that if we reserve Anything Goes for just the God tier Pokemon only, that look at the bottom half of the UBERS tier. There's a crazy difference in power level between the top of the chart and the bottom of the chart, right?
This ties into what makes a metagame fun, right?
Yeah.
Like for you, like what makes a metagame fun, and what do you want to see of a metagame, and a metagame fun is like balance is important, but fun is also important because people won't play if there's no fun,
and they won't watch, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and let's talk about that briefly because you brought it up. So we have this Bush Tush game from yesterday against Exaline, I think that's how you pronounce it. And they were both playing in UBERS, and they both have a Regenerator Pokemon in Toxapex or Ho-Oh. They both have a Yveltal Eternatus Core, and they both have a Necrozma. So we can already see sort of that centralization of the metagame. Then they have a Ghost type, and then they have an extra Pokemon. So very balanced teams on the face of it, but then how many turns did it end up being? Like 100 and... Let's see.
Yeah, and it's crazy too because in the beginning there were some really cool sets, right? Like Stored Power, Dragoness, Weakness Policy.
Yeah, and you had the Trick Ring Target. That was cool.
There was a lot of cool stuff there, but at the end of the day, when things don't kill because of power level and because of bulk and things like that, you gotta go back to what you need to use.
Yep. And so we had a 128 turn game. And looking back on it, I look at that 128 turn and I'm like, oh, that wasn't so bad. But that's only because I've become inured to this crazy turn number. triple digit games, I believe personally, should not exist in Pokemon. And I know that some people might think, well, that's just because they're bad. But I think that looking at other games, when you are trying to create a fun, playable game for people, looking at people's time and respecting the amount of time they're willing to put into something, I think is really important. That's why certain MOBAs do better than others, right? Pokemon Unite has like, what is a 15-minute timer or something like that? 10-minute timer. I have never played it, but I've watched it. And then you have games like League of Legends. How long does that go usually? It's
hour.
Yeah, it's an
plus.
hour. And so does that bring more casuals into the fray, or does that bring more like uber competitive, crazy people into the fray? Well, I would argue the more competitive people are going to League of Legends. Now you could say, well, that's what we want in the Smogon community. We want more competitive people. But I don't think that's what you want, because if you look at League of Legends and the people that invites or entices,
the people that attracts, yeah, I get it.
I don't think that's who I want to have in my metagame.
So this is really interesting, because I do think there's obviously, a good point being brought here that sometimes what makes a good metagame, is it fun or not? And also the players themselves should enjoy when they play. A lot of people don't like that tier. A lot of people are not enjoying UBERS as they're playing it. One of my most fun experiences with UBERS was when I had to play UBERS, and also like I had to learn it for the UBERS Open, and I had a really good time in some games because I love playing, aggressive top tier. I'm so tired of my team using my face in every emote. They went to my Discord and they took my face emotes for everything, and now they're posting them every time. But like when I played UBERS, I tried to use really cool models like Darmanitan, because I think they were cool and unique. But a lot of the games were really, it was like Little Cup. They're really systematic, right? You knock me in, fool. You do this. UBERS, you knock a Veltal, you toxic it to pressure it enough, and you basically go from there. So it's just something that I don't know. I feel like what makes a good metagame, is it good for playing? Does everybody enjoy it while they're playing? All that is something that's it's a deeper video. It's something we've actually talked about as well. It's something that we want to do too. So yeah, we'll
have to definitely return to that topic at some point, because then I can get into my Gen 2 rant, but that doesn't fit into this video.
But the thing is too, I think in certain tiers it's better that way. Like I actually enjoy. If you like the tier, and there's a huge difference between Gen 2 and like Toxapex, right? Like in a sense, and I want to compare it to that too. And that, again, that's a whole different story. And like Eternatus doing it, there's a difference when it's certain Pokemon.
We'd have to figure that out for sure, because I do think that there's a similarity between 252 in all stats and Regenerator. But there are certain differences as well, so you just have to figure it out. But yeah, I think that the UBERS tier, if it wants to be fun, right, you have to have a metagame with variety. And right now, I would say that's one big problem the UBERS tier has, is that there's no variety. You can't really play with that bottom, like. It's not even 50%. It's more like 75% of the tier.
Had that for a while too. Like we had Primal Groudon last gen, but the reason we were able to deal with it was because Z moves made the unpredictability, so you could actually still use mons that were previously inferior in Gen 6, because Palkia and stuff. One of the greatest Pokemon, Specs Palkia, wasn't used because it couldn't click Water Move. Right, Kyogre literally stopped being one of the best Ubers, because it was up there as the best Uber for like 3 generations. Gen 3, 4, and 5, Kyogre is considered the best Uber. Though in Gen 5, I'd argue Genesect. Like I said, I'd argue Genesect is better. But that mon became basically extinct, and you had to use Primal Kyogre just because of Primal Groudon. And then Gen 7 gave us Z moves, so we actually had options to be able to do some things versus this Pokemon. Right, like Xerneas could now beat it if it went for a certain Z move, though obviously the setup and did things. But now we don't have that option, right? In Gen 8, we don't. We did have that option called Dynamax, but that's not allowed. So, does you have to make Does it have to be more chaotic to be fun? Does it have to be more unpredictable to be fun? Or
I think you gotta bend the rules, right? To bring up a basketball example, and then I'm not like a super basketball nerd, but as I understand it, most of the NBA involves traveling, and it's allowed, right? How many times do you get into the paint and you take like 5 steps to make your layup? And if I was playing basketball, I would be somebody who's saying, no, that's traveling. You're not allowed to do that, and we're not allowed to grab people's arms to pull them down for a foul, and then you get to go to the free throw line, because I'm a very play by the rules kind of person. But that also wouldn't be a very fun kind of way to play basketball. And so I think that when you're making a product, as Smogon is, that you got to make a product that's both fun to play and it's fun to watch. So you bring a little street ball in there, you bend the rules a little bit, you make it more chaotic. I know that the competitive players don't like losing. When you don't like to lose, you want to bring things that are more safe, that are more reliable. You're not bringing Hustle Durant to your games. You're not bringing strategies that can get beat down if your opponent just brings 1 or 2 Pokemon that counter it, right? You're bringing Clefable, you're bringing Regenerator, you're bringing things that are going to be really reliable. And so I can understand why you don't want to make a metagame more hectic by, banning Yveltal to anything goes, because then you say, oh, what's going to check fill in the blank Pokemon? Well, I don't know. We can figure it out though. Personally, I don't know if that would even be a good idea. But if you just look at that bottom 50% and you say, is it invalidated by like most of the current metagame? Right? Is Lunala invalidated by most of the metagame? Yes, it is. Because you have Eternatus, which can Toxic it, and then you can shuffle around your Pokemon. You have Yveltal being a huge one, and you have another Ghost type that completely just rides over it. So you can't use Lunala at all, really. It doesn't even have what Marshadow has, which is priority. You've got things like Pheromosa, which are so frail and not powerful enough for the UBERS tier that there's literally absolutely no reason why you should ever be using Pheromosa. Which is, frankly, similar to how Rayquaza is in a point. And then you got Pokemon like Darmanitan, which are confused and lost, and like, how did I even get here, man? Because Darmanitan only got one thing going for it, and it's so gimmicky that it's not going to work in the UBERS tier at all.
No, but it actually is very good in the UBERS tier. Don't get me wrong. It actually that is something. It's very good in the UBERS tier
if it can get in.
Oh yeah. But typically you have U-turn, Veltal, or something, and all you have to do in order for that mon to put in work is to Flare Blitz or Earthquake once, literally once into Necrozma, and then you just click Ice Whip Crash the entire time.
Yeah, I guess. If I saw more people using it, then maybe I would buy into that. But
I understand why maybe you wouldn't feel that way.
Yeah,
about it.
And I guess like I'm not too familiar with the tier beyond what I've watched. And if I'm not watching, a lot of people use that. I know I watched your video where you used it, so I have that as a reference point. Then of course it doesn't help when my Pokemon that I want to use are really bad. So if I'm looking at the viability rankings right now, I'm looking at D rank. A reminder that these Pokemon are only UBERS by tiering and possess no real metagame niche. Well, that's harsh. We've got Genesect, we've got Kyurem White, we've got Naganadel. I think those are some of the most fun UBERS. I love strong special attackers, and they just cannot be used. Like, Genesect is bad. Kyurem White hasn't really been good since Gen 5, I would argue. And Naganadel...
It's just not strong enough.
Yeah, it's not. And you look at its special attack stat and you say, that's not strong enough, but it doesn't have anything else going for it. And nowadays I have to decide if it wants to run heavy duty boots or choice Scarf or choice Specs. And then if I have a Blissey or whatever it is, I can just sponge a hit or two, switch around, and suddenly you're chipped down and now you're dead. So I wish that there were a tier in between OU and UBERS that we could play, or ban more Pokemon to the Anything Goes tier so that UBERS can open up and we can get more variety, I think.
I wouldn't be against it either. Like, I think it would make an interesting tier, to say the least, right? It'd be extremely, extremely interesting.
And I guess...
Because...
Yeah.
Go on, sorry.
Well, just to sort of wrap things up, or to start wrapping things up, and to put a sort of bow on it, I think looking forward, we need to take this into consideration, that if we want people to play the UBERS tier, or if we want ourselves to play the UBERS tier and not hate ourselves, we're going to have to start making some major changes, because I don't see in Gen 9 and Gen 10 that the Game Freak's going to take their foot off the gas, right? We've seen the power creep. We've seen the crazy new abilities, the wacky new moves, right? We're going to give you a move that always crits on a Pokemon that you can't protect against. Although maybe that's not a good example, because Urshifu's not like fantastic. But and then we're going to make tons of beast boosting Pokemon. We had the Gen 7 beast boosters, but now we have As 1, which is beast boost plus another ability. And it's always the good beast boost too. So we've got these snowball Pokemon. And I think in Gen 9 we'll probably see more Pokemon that are even more powerful. And so the Gen 4, Gen 5 Pokemon.
They're talking about, there's some things that are talking about potentially, we could see those guys having terrain abilities. Like imagine that, right? Mm-hmm. Imagine the legendaries with terrain, or I don't know, something else. Like I think you have a good point. Like we had Magearna, right? We had Soul Heart, and then we're having these super beast boost. Then we had beast boost and stuff, and now we're having like super beast boost, and who knows?
And imagine this: you give Miraidon Magic Guard and Shift Gear and Recover. And whatever you want. You give Koraidon
why the hell not?
Huge power plus shift gear. Right? Whatever you want to give it, it only takes one or two things to completely throw the balance of the game out of whack. They look like they're going to be fast Pokemon. Speed is everything. I eventually want to make a video about speed and why it's so important in singles. But speed is everything. Having the upper hand in that, and then having the one or two moves that are just going to completely throw you out of whack. Game Freak loves that, because that gets people excited about the games, gets them excited about the DLC, which they don't have to pay for, but now they're going to have to pay for it. So they're going to be...
the DLC is the same as a third game, Oh, to me, it's the same thing, but it's actually adding something.
Right. And so I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but I'm just saying that that's sort of their mentality, that's their strategy. And so the UBERS tier should brace itself for that. It should go in anticipating that this is the game plan moving forward. And if I'm going to corral all of these Pokemon in and say they're not allowed to go to OU because that would mess up the Lando, Pex, Clef metagame that we've got going, instead we're going to keep them in UBERS, but they're literally unplayable in UBERS for the most part. Well, why are we doing that? Just make it anything goes the new UBERS like it was before Mega Rayquaza, and then make UBERS be, just a tier above. That's my philosophy, at least.
I can respect that. I think that's a good. I think that's fine. Like I think that's fair, very fair, especially with everything like what we have going on and everything. I think that's a very fair philosophy.
Yeah, and then going forward, I think that Smogon just needs to make a few. It needs to have a few philosophy changes on how it does its tiering, but that we can save that for a different day. Just in terms of how. To make the metagame fun, because we don't want to have this regenerator, toxic, Eternatus stuff going on. But yeah, I think that's all we're going to have for today's video. Thank you so much for coming on my channel. I really appreciate it.
Bro. Anytime.
Yeah, and that'll be it. So I'll catch you guys later.